The immune system's like a juggler. It can juggle thousands of processes very elegantly. And mold is like a guy across the room throwing baseballs at the juggler. You know, the juggler is going to have to make a decision. Am I going to continue to juggle these processes, or am I going to defend myself from this evolutionary threat? And so what I'm telling you is that the balls get dropped. In order to protect itself from mold, all these other processes go to the wayside. And so that's how mold-related illness really kicks off.
Welcome to Ayık Kafa podcast. I have a very important topic today. I've been thinking about this for a while now. I have Jason Earle here. He has a company in the United States, and it is called gotmold.com. But we're not going to talk just about the company, but I had the chance to meet him at one of the conferences. We were at Hack Your Health conference. So Jason, welcome. And I want to start like this. You know, mold is a word that I think we do not take it very seriously. Especially, you know, we can also eat cheese with mold. It's a special cheese, Roquefort or blue cheese. So, you know, and you see in some fruits, some, you know, moldy parts, but, you know, I'm translating at the same time into Turkish in my mind. Mold in English for me sounds more devastating than when I translate into Turkish. When I was living in the United States, I started hearing the black mold phenomena and how dangerous it is, how it's a health hazard. I've been hearing that. Then I had a fire in my apartment in New York, and the sprinkler system, they couldn't shut it off. And, you know, within a day, they came to cut all the walls 4 feet from the floor because they were like afraid that the mold is going to be building up because all these walls are sheetrock. So I kind of knew. Then I came to Turkey, and in my apartment that I'm living now, there was a constant water leak from upstairs. And with that thought behind my head, you know, mold is not quite good, you know, we're not able to stop this. You know, I'm asking to the contractor, finally he says that, you know, there are some specific plasters that is locking in mold, which I know you have your own thought. Then I started paying attention. Most apartments that I go visit, I'm not just talking about basement where people live. There's all these, you know, musty smell over there. But most apartment, in my mom's apartment, I see some wall paints are buckling. In my sister's apartment or house, they say like, you know, we had a leaking balcony and it leaked forever, but I can still see the paint. Then I go to my client's apartment. So I started seeing this, okay, now we're taking it in Turkey, this mold thing. It's so lightly. When I met you, I said, you know, I really need to talk to Jason. Actually, I have the kit over here. I still didn't try it in my apartment, in my house, because I have to send these to America. One time I heard from a friend last winter, and that was for a very serious health condition that her cousin was having a cancer treatment. So they sent someone to her home for mold cleaning. So that was the only time I heard, because, you know, probably there were American educated something. They heard from someone. Maybe the oncologist said, I have no idea, but it's not a big issue. But more I dig into it, I mean, it is really dangerous for brain health, for I'm sure other systemic inflammation. I'm going to hear from you. And there are so many different types. So maybe you want to start with a little bit with your own story, because like all of us, I was in active addiction before I got into this addiction field and become a psychologist. You had your own sets of issues with mold, and then we can start like that.
Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me, and it's really good to see you here again today. My story is not dissimilar to a lot of people who are in this space, actually, which is the mold and indoor air quality space. So more broadly than mold, I'm really in the healthy building business and helping people navigate how to deal with issues that may make their building healthy, or even try to help them initially build buildings that are healthy. But mold is the primary aggravator, really, because it's basically the byproduct of moisture. Moisture is the enemy of a good building. Moisture problems occur very commonly, and we build buildings here in the U.S. in particular out of mold food. So mold is the sort of the first alarm that gets rung, if you will, when there's a problem. So As I was saying, I got into this space because of my own personal experience and the awareness that my childhood illness was actually caused by the conditions in the home that I grew up in. So when I was about 4 years old, I suddenly lost a lot of weight in a short period of time. So my parents took me to the pediatrician, who quickly said, "You need to take him to the hospital. This looks serious." The first diagnosis at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, which is a renowned respiratory clinic, was cystic fibrosis, which was my father's worst nightmare coming true. He'd lost 4 of his cousins to CF before the age of 14. They spent 6 weeks crying while they waited for a second opinion. And thankfully, I did not have CF. I do not have CF. What I had was asthma compounded by pneumonia. And when they tested me for allergies, I was positive for every single thing that they tested me for. So it was grass, wheat, corn, eggs, dogs, cats, cotton, soybeans. And I grew up on this little farm surrounded by all those things in abundance. So I essentially lived on inhalers until I was about 12 years old, at which point my folks split up. I moved out of that musty farmhouse and all my symptoms went away. And it was chalked up to what they call spontaneous adolescent remission, which is a fancy term for we have no idea what the hell happened. In my family, they said, well, Papa grew out of his asthma. My grandfather had grown out of his when he was adolescent. And so it was just dismissed. In the next 2 years, a series of things happened, and one of which is very relevant to the story. Number one is 2 years after I moved out, my mother committed suicide in that home. And she was troubled for a long time. And so this wasn't really that much of a surprise to us. And there's no way to actually know what went on there. She was also an alcoholic, which runs deeply in my genes, which is something we can touch on. But I ended up not putting the pieces of the puzzle around that for quite some time. And then 2 years after that, I got diagnosed with Lyme disease. And I'm still not sure that I actually had it, but I do know that I was treated for it. And the antibiotics did quite a number on my digestive system. And so I learned quickly that I had to eat a cleaner diet to deal with that, especially basically a keto diet, which is also relevant for this conversation. And then I ended up, through a series of crazy circumstances, and getting recruited out of a gas station where I was working to go work on Wall Street. And I ended up doing that for 9 years. And actually relevant to the addiction conversation, I found myself less and less satisfied, more and more disenchanted. And of course, with that, my alcohol and substance abuse, continued to increase. And I decided that it was just time for me to go do something meaningful with my life. And so while I was away, I decided to put everything 20 pounds of stuff in a backpack, and I sold my firm and I walked away. I ended up in Hawaii. And while I was there, I had a lot of time on my hands, and I was reading stories about a local hotel that had been shut down for a mold problem. And it was a huge mold problem. It was a $55 million mold remediation project, the largest in history at the time, and still arguably the largest today. And what caught my attention was not just the eye-popping numbers, but it was really some of the stories of people who had been affected by it. Specifically, there was a gentleman who, at 40 years old, had developed adult-onset asthma and all of these allergies that he had never had before. And so for me, it was like a deja vu moment, right? Where it was like a time machine. Suddenly I thought, geez, I wonder if our home had this problem, because it was my life in reverse, right? So I had those issues and they went away, and he had developed these issues as a result of the mold exposure.
So tell me something. You're saying this, and my mind went when I was like 14 years old. We were living on Bosphorus for our summer home that we were renting, and I had a sudden allergic asthma attack. I had nothing before. I was like 14 years old, and they brought the spray from the neighbor. The guy had that asthma, and then it opened my breathing. And then a year later, I went to France to study, and they took me to some clinic for allergy testing or whatever, but I was afraid of my blood to be drawn, and I didn't let it do. But then suddenly it went away. So that's what I'm going to ask you. Does it only happen, let's say, sometimes to one person in the family, or everyone gets affected?
So it's very common for 5 people to be living in a home and have one person with the most pronounced symptoms. And that's generally the reason why we're there, right? Because they're in a bad place. I learned early on that you have to interview everybody that you can, because you'll find out that they're also experiencing something in many cases, but they may not necessarily connect it to the building. So oftentimes after the remediation is done, what we'll find is that sure enough, the person who called us in is experiencing some relief. And it may be a longer road for them. It's possible that they may not be immediately recovered, but when we talked to the people who were not complaining, who were saying, this is nonsense, there's no mold here, or I'm not sick, I don't understand what's going on. If they're honest enough, oftentimes they'll sit down and they'll say, I noticed that I'm sleeping through the night. I noticed that I'm not as irritable. There's something called mold rage, which is actually a real thing. They'll say, I'm not blowing my nose 100 times a day. I don't have a headache. My fatigue is almost gone. And so what we find is that people have sort of adjusted their baseline health, their expectations of their baseline health downward, chalking it up to age or, whatever. And what they find is that when you clean this stuff up, suddenly many of these sort of background issues tend to abate. It affects everybody differently. This is a very bio-individual issue.
Now, educate us a little bit, because we spoke about the mold. There's that black mold. If it's the same thing, I don't know. There's the mycotoxins. There's the VOC. And they're actually, under the mycotoxins, there are multiple different aflatoxins and this, that, and the other. And the details of different molds, how it happens, which one is more dangerous. What shall we do? Walk us through, because so many names, and it all ends up under the mold umbrella, I guess.
Yes, the science is fascinating. The thing about mold is that it always starts with a moisture problem. So mold spores, which are like the little hardy reproductive capsules, kind of like seeds, are everywhere, okay? So in every breath you take, whether you're indoors or outdoors, if you're at a hospital, a school, it doesn't matter. Every breath you take, you're going to be breathing in some spores. So that's the first thing to understand, is that mold is a very normal part of a healthy environment. Without mold, we'd be in big trouble. All the plants, all the dead trees, all that stuff would never decay. And so we would end up with big piles of dead plant matter, which is why we have oil and coal and things like that, because there was a time when we didn't have those things. And that's actually what led to what they call the Carboniferous period. So anyway, it's enough with sixth grade science, geological history. So mold spores are actually the most abundant biological particulate on the planet. Every year, and this is a fun fact, kingdom fungi, which includes mushrooms, which are known as macrofungi, and yeasts and molds, which are known as microfungi. Every year, kingdom fungi produces 50 megatons of spores, which is the equivalent of 500,000 blue whales, okay? Wow. To get your mind around that further, that's about 10 times as much tea as the world drinks every year, okay? So it's a huge, huge amount of spores. These go up into the clouds, they influence weather, so we're never going to get away from spores. Problem with spores is that when they land on a surface, whether they're in our homes or outside, if the right conditions are present, they'll begin to grow. The right conditions are essentially excess moisture, because mold will eat just about anything as long as it's organic.
So hold on. First, I need to understand. Okay, this is very, very creepy sci-fi things that I'm listening. So it's everywhere. So it's not like something wet is producing the mold. It's everywhere. And when they see a wet surface, whether it's the fruit, the building, the whatever, and then it kind of goes there to lodge in a way.
Most of the time, the spores are already there. So if you were to look microscopically at every surface, whether it's on your glasses, the face of your watch, all over your clothes, you will find mold spores. And so every mold spore has a different, or every type, every species has a different sort of combination lock that it needs in terms of conditions for it to begin to grow. So that means it needs the right temperature, it needs the right amount of moisture condition, it needs the right kind of food. These are also aerobic organisms, so they require oxygen. If those things line up just right, just like a combination lock, suddenly this metabolic process opens up, and the spore, just like a seed, will send a little shoot out, and it's called a hyphae. And that goes down into whatever material it is. It could be a piece of dust. It could be the sheetrock on your wall. It will begin to release enzymes, kind of like how we digest. It'll begin to release enzymes, and then those enzymes extract nutrition from the material that's growing on, and then begin to release these gases. And these gases are what we smell when we note that there's a musty odor. And those gases are known to be neurotoxic. Recent animal studies have been pointing to these as a potential source of most mold-related illness, as opposed to the mycotoxins, which some molds produce sometimes when they're growing, mostly as an anti-competitive mechanism. So they produce these mycotoxins to keep other molds that are also trying to grow and eat the same stuff. They're producing them to keep. It's like it's chemical warfare at a microscopic level.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really pretty fascinating stuff. But there's a misconception that mycotoxins, because it's a very scary word, by the way, mycotoxins are actually not the source of most mold-related illness. Mycotoxins are produced by about 100 species out of the 100,000 or so that are known to science. And even those species only produce them intermittently when they're threatened, like I said, and when there's a really good nutrition source, because it's metabolically expensive, is the way the researchers describe it. It's very difficult to make these toxins, and so they don't produce them unless they absolutely have to. So basically, mold-related illness has to do with exposure to the spores, which can trigger allergic reactions and inflammatory responses, or the musty smell, which can trigger allergic reactions, inflammatory responses, and toxic responses, as well as the mycotoxins, which, generally speaking, we're mostly exposed to them in food, not in air. However, there are circumstances where there's high spore counts, where something's been disturbed, and there's a very moldy environment where there are very high spore counts, and you can be exposed to the mycotoxins. And those can trigger a whole series of other symptoms too, as well as, primarily toxic and inflammatory responses. So mold is very complex. There's a lot of different aspects to it. But in all cases, the most important thing to remember is that mold growth indoors, a mold problem is a moisture problem, and mold will not grow if there's not moisture.
Mold and black mold, are they different?
Black mold is what the media has done.
It sounds like the Black Widow, the spider. It sounds scarier.
Again, the media has done such a good job of black mold, toxic mold, and that is to say that black mold is worse than the others is to say that we shouldn't worry about the other ones, but this is not true. Even if mycotoxins were the issue, there are lots of mycotoxin-producing molds that are not black, and there are plenty of black molds that don't produce mycotoxins. So the color of the mold is not really relevant. However, there is one mold called Stachybotrys that is black. It's got a cousin named Chytomium, and they tend to hang out together. And they both really like paper. They both really like sheetrock. And so they tend to show up in similar situations. And so they are very aggressive molds, but they're very slow growing. And they're sort of at the top of the food chain. And they also have the chemical weapons. And they have been linked to a number of different ailments. So they are a problem. In fact, what's really fascinating about those is that Dr. Birgitte Andersen at Danish University in Copenhagen found that all sheetrock in the United States, and maybe internationally, all commercial drywall actually has the Stachybotrys and Chytomium spores already in the paper. So they use recycled cardboard to make the sheetrock, and they leave it out. People recycle their cardboard, they throw it outside. It gets wet. Well, it doesn't get picked up day one. Sometimes it sits out there for a couple of days and it gets processed, and the whole thing they basically end up recycling moldy cardboard. And those spores are very, very durable, and they end up making their way through the manufacturing process. And so when the moisture conditions present themselves, as they often do, the spores are already there. You don't even have to wait for them to come in through the window.
Okay, let's start with then moisture-driven mold. Let's talk about a couple of scenarios. When there's the smell, the musty smell, obviously you know that it's there. Are there ways that there's no smell, but there's the mold, and maybe it's behind the cabinet, maybe it's under the sink, but you don't smell? Are they affecting the same way the system? Or the one that you said that it's kind of dormant in a way, but whenever there's a moist, it starts waking up?
So most of the time when you have a mold problem that's actively growing, which means that there's a moisture condition that's persistent, the musty smell will be produced. Now, whether you actually smell it or not has to do with your sense of smell, clearly, which, by the way, gets impacted by congestion caused by mold exposure. So you can actually lose some of your ability to smell because of the thing that you're smelling. So this is kind of a little bit of a tricky situation. Also, in order for you to be exposed to a pollutant, and so whether it be car exhaust or a musty smell or whatever, you have to have a pathway to the person. So there's 4 Ps. There's the pollutant, So that in this case would be the mold or the musty smell. We have pathways, which is how it gets to you. You've got pressurizations, which actually move the air around in the building. Pressures from fans and HVAC systems and open windows and things like that. And then you also have the people. So you have to have all four to have exposure: pollutants, pathways, pressures, and people. It's not uncommon for there to be an active mold problem that someone doesn't smell because it's stuck in a cavity where there's no way for the airflow to get to them. In those cases, it's rare that you're going to have serious symptoms. However, there are people that are very, very sensitive to these things. And once they've become sensitized to them, and they can become sensitized because of a mold exposure, past mold exposure, or they can be sensitized actually because of a past chemical exposure, because the chemicals that mold produces, the musty smell, look a lot like industrial chemicals. They're very, very similar. And so the body doesn't know the difference. And so once it becomes hypersensitive, it can have a really outsized response. And the research that's really fascinating about this comes down to these nerves in the face called the trigeminal nerve. And they have nerve endings in the eyes, mouth, and jaw. The most basic way that the trigeminal nerve works is it senses heat, cold, and pain. But the nerve endings also are able to sense chemicals in very small amounts. And so they get triggered very easily, and then they create an inflammatory response, which actually leads to a cytokine storm. And so people can end up having a really outsized reaction from very small amounts once they become sensitized. So the musty smell is usually the dead giveaway, but it's not always present. And also, if mold has become dormant, the moisture problem has stopped, or sometimes it just pauses, right? It hasn't rained for a while. Then that musty smell will go away temporarily because, again, the musty smell is the byproduct of active digestion, and it needs the moisture to do that. It's not always so straightforward. That's why, a proper inspection by someone who knows what they're looking at is often very necessary to get to the bottom of the more complex problems.
Let's say there's a leak from upstairs, or like in my case, we finally were able to figure out the source of where the water was coming. It took us forever. But that room, yes, there was the musty smell. Obviously, it was like water was coming, but it dries at some point. We found the source. What happens then?
This is controversial, okay? So a lot of people that have suffered through mold-related illness will take issue with this, but this is the reality. If mold is in a wall and it has not made its way through the wall, it's not growing on the surface, and the moisture problem stops, and there's no more active growth. Remember, we talked about people, pollutants, pathways, pressures, and people. There is no way to have exposure. So just to be clear, this is not a radioactive substance that can harm you at a distance. You have to have contact with it or one of its constituent components. So spores, musty smell, or the gases, the compounds that comprise the musty smell. And by the way, I should also make it clear, not all the chemicals that are in the musty odor are actually odorous. There are some that don't have a distinctive odor, but still trigger an immune response. But they generally don't travel alone, okay? So I know that's a little bit of I'm splitting hairs a little bit here, but I just want to be clear that the musty smell is very complex, and it's being researched by very smart people, and no one's completely figured it out. It's about 50 or so compounds that are commonly found, maybe as much as 500. And so what we talk about the musty smell, it's really like potpourri, okay? But the bottom line is that mold in a wall that is not actively growing, that doesn't have any growth on the wall, is generally regarded as not hazardous, okay? Now, the moment that gets disturbed, that's a health hazard. So it's not a good idea to leave it there. And also, the moment the moisture problem returns, it's now a health hazard again. So, and now it's already ramped up. The army is in the wall. It's resting. You put a little water on there, and next thing you know, it starts to produce the chemicals again. So it's not something to take lightly. You want to just leave it, but it's not as much of a health hazard when it's become dormant.
What are the symptoms? What type of neurological disorders you said that is now able to be detected? What else happens to the person who is exposed to mold?
The list is so long. We could just read a list and we'd be here for an hour, okay? Because it impacts everybody differently, but it's primarily, let's just break it down into sort of the big buckets.
Sure.
Allergies, allergic-like responses, upper respiratory, hay fever, A lot of people end up with dermatitis or itchy eyes or hives. Obviously, asthma. If people have pre-existing conditions around that, COPD, exacerbation of pre-existing respiratory issues is a major concern. In fact, that's a potentially lethal concern. Inflammatory stuff is the hallmark of mold. And so if you think about any inflammatory condition, mold makes it worse. In fact, autoimmune disease in general, and now we have about 100 well-recognized autoimmune diseases, which is kind of a wild hallmark of our society now. And almost all of them have an inflammatory component. And so what we see a lot of is people that have, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, ME, whatever the case may be. It gets brought out very easily by mold. So the immune system's like a juggler. It can juggle thousands of processes very elegantly. And mold is like a guy across the room throwing baseballs at the juggler. The juggler is going to have to make a decision. Am I going to continue to juggle these processes, or am I going to defend myself from this evolutionary threat? And so what I'm telling you is that the balls get dropped. In order to protect itself from mold, all these other processes go to the wayside. And so that's how mold-related illness really kicks off. You've also got these toxicity symptoms, and that's primarily probably caused by food-based exposures due to contaminated food, which is very common with nuts, seeds, grains, spices, conventional meats and dairy here in the U.S. because the animals are often fed corn and things like that they shouldn't be fed that happens to be moldy. What people consider toxic reactions are oftentimes inflammatory responses. It just looks like toxicity. And because the word mycotoxin sounds like toxicity, people tend to conflate the two. They tend to call one the other. But some of the stuff that's really fascinating, we talked about my mom's early demise at the beginning of the show. It's really pretty fascinating because at the time when she died, I had no idea what was going on. I had no idea about mold at all. And in 2008, after I'd been in the industry already for 5 years or so, Brown University did a study, and they looked at 6,000 people, or talked to 6,000 people. And they asked them if they had moisture problems in the home, if they had any mold that they were aware of. And then they asked them essentially, how you doing? It was a quality of life questionnaire. And what they found was a very strong correlation between mold and dampness indoors and depression. Of course, that hit home for me, right? And I couldn't help but wonder if that had been a contributing factor to my mother's death. Years later, 2015, Dr. Joan Bennett, who's a good friend of mine at Rutgers University, she had her own mold exposure. She went down to her house in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina came through. And she walked in wearing an N95 respirator, which protects you from spores, and potentially the mycotoxins are on the spores, but the smell comes right through, right? We all know that from COVID, right? The odors come through those masks. Sure. And so she was shocked because she was so ill from being in her home, this musty, what she called a fungal utopia. The whole house was just loaded with mold, including her books on mycology, on the study of molds. They were all moldy. Very ironically. She ends up having to take a few breaks. She had to walk out and catch her breath and then went back in. Eventually, she just curtailed the whole thing and decided to stop the exercise. But she came back to her lab, changed in many ways, primarily focused now on what was in that musty smell. And so she began studying the compounds that are in it with fruit flies, as well as some plants. And she found that the fruit flies stop producing dopamine. They stop reproducing. They start flying down instead of to the light. They also develop what she characterized as Parkinsonian-like symptoms. So essentially, neurotoxicity was what she nailed down. Also, a mitochondrial disorder, which is really fascinating because one of the most common elements of autoimmune disease is mitochondrial dysfunction, or what they call cell danger response, which essentially means that the mitochondria stops producing energy, and then you become fatigued. You can see that we are affected very similarly, where fatigue is a primary symptom. So headaches, nausea, dizziness, fatigue, difficulty concentrating, cognitive impairment. These are very common symptoms of mold. This is primarily from the microbial VOCs.
How long do you need to be living or spending time? Because I hear, Dave Asprey speaks often about his mold exposure and his brain. Actually, he was diagnosed, if I'm not mistaken, with Asperger disorder. Then years later, they were able to figure out that he didn't have the disorder, but it was most probably due to some mold toxicity.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I've known Dave for a long time. He may have Asperger's. It's very possible. But, it also could be very much, caused by an inflammatory condition.
So how can we know, let's say that, is there a way to measure if we have mold in our system?
Right now, and that's a really good question. It's an important one. By the way, just circling back a little bit, there's a large group of people in the mental health space that are now referring to depression and anxiety as an inflammatory condition. This runs right in the face of the chemical imbalance thesis that has been, driving all of the medication and, this crazy pharmaceutical push. Whereas, it may very well be that many of the ailments that we suffer from are actually caused by poor indoor air quality, including Dave. Dave lived in a basement apartment or in a basement bedroom. That's a chronic exposure. If you're sleeping 8 hours a day, and when you're fatigued, you're spending more time in that environment. So you're actually oftentimes the sickness causes you to have more exposure to the very thing that's making you sick. It's like a vicious cycle that happens very commonly with mold-related illness. People stop leaving the house. Well, they spend too much time in bed. Now, is there a test for it? I wish. And so we're working on one, actually. We're working on a blood test for mold exposure that will pick up the musty smell. They'll pick up not the smell itself, but the compounds that comprise the musty smell. And so we're also working on a blood test for a genetic expression test to see if you've been exposed. But right now, the only tests that are available actually are junk science. So these mycotoxin urine panels, which are very, very popular, do not accurately reflect environmental exposure. In other words, they do not reflect what you're breathing. They reflect what you're eating. The numbers don't line up. There's no human study that validates these things. It's basically a test that's been used in veterinary medicine for a long time because that's how farm animals are exposed, through food. So we took that same technology and used it for people and forgot, well, that's not how they're exposed. And so we're testing people and sending them on these wild goose chases for mold in their home. And oftentimes what they're actually dealing with is mold in their food when it comes to these mycotoxin panels. Also, there's another test, and we talked about this before we hit record, that looks at your blood, but it looks for the antibodies to mycotoxins. And this is even further removed from the truth because now it's saying that you were exposed to something in your food at one point in the last 4 months, but it's being sold as something that says that you're being exposed to it in your air today. These are both highly questionable. There's no human validation studies that have been done on these. And so I would highly recommend people avoid these tests as a human diagnostic for building-related exposure. So unfortunately, the diagnosis is largely a clinical diagnosis. Basically, it would be an inquiry. Have you had any water damage in your building? These are the questions we ask. Is there a musty smell? Does anybody have symptoms that seem to get better when you leave the building? Does the building have a history of water damage? Okay. Is there any visible mold or is there any history of mold in the building? Very simple questions, but that's the key, because if you answer yes to any of those, and you have symptoms that seem to line up with the ones that I've just laid out, then very likely you have a problem. And so oftentimes the best thing to do is take a break from the building if you can. And that can be a challenge, but still, if you can go away for a week or 2 weeks, you'll find out that, especially if you don't go to a moldy hotel, you'll find out that if your health profile changes, if you suddenly start thinking clearer, you sleep better through the night, and you're having less congestion, and you're less inflamed and things like that, that may be the test that you need. The other tests tend to confuse, unfortunately.
Let's talk about the food, because, people who are listening to us may say, what, I don't have a problem because I don't have a leak, I don't have moisture in my apartment house, there's no problem. But my understanding is food contamination is a huge problem.
Huge. It is ubiquitous. And this is something that I was very surprised by as I began looking into the research. 2018 study done by a group of food scientists found that 60 to 80% of imported grains are contaminated with mycotoxins here in the U.S. It is a very common issue all over the world. We here in the U.S. actually have very low standards for this. In the EU, there are specific requirements for border crossings with food. And so they will generally reject food there's a whole litany of reasons why they would do it. Number one is for bacterial contamination, so spoilage. Number two is for mycotoxins. Those foods that are rejected at border crossings for mycotoxins, they ship them to the U.S. So we're more than willing to take moldy food. And Dave Asprey, by the way, also talks about this with coffee. How there were 1,000 shipping containers, I think they were heading for Japan, were rejected, and we took them. This is not a unique story. You hear this all the time. Dr. Mark Philaday from Amen Clinic tells very similar stories when he does his presentation about mycotoxins. And by the way, a lot of what I talk about when it comes to mycotoxins in food and these tests is based on conversations with some of the most respected scientists that I know. And Dr. Mark Philaday at Amen Clinic is one of the thought leaders on this and is very outspoken about these mycotoxin urine panels not being used because he was the one who helped develop them. And then he realized that they were basically creating more problems than they were solving. So, but what he found was that everybody that came into his clinic that was using these panels was showing positive. Everybody.
Walk me through though. How does these food get contaminated?
Yeah, it happens all the way back at the farmer's fields. So really the biggest violators are nuts, seeds, grains, things like that. So agricultural products. And so what happens is sometimes they get moldy while they're still in the field. And that's part of the reason why you see fungicides and chemicals being used in farming is because they lose so much crop to these infections. And so some of these infections that occur, for example, fusarium, which is a very powerful mycotoxin producing mold that grows on corn.
I took a note about that. Thank you for starting, because I was like, what is that?
If you go back and you look at the history of mold, so to speak, we have had a number of huge plagues that were actually caused by contaminated grains. There's even evidence like the Salem witch trials was possibly caused by essentially hallucinatory behavior caused by contaminated grains. Rye in particular, ergot was growing on rye in these grain stores. This has happened on every continent across time. And so it's not a new thing. It's just that we now are willing to, on an industrial basis, process these foods that have been contaminated. And we have an allowable level. There is an allowable level that we accept. The problem is that one food can have an allowable level. And then if you eat 4 or 5 other ones, they all have an allowable level. They synergize together. And so you may have an allowable level on one thing on your plate, but if that allowable level is in all 5, you can end up with a real problem. And this is a very, very common issue. It's the globalization of our food supply. It's the industrialization of our food supply that has led to this homogenous, this widespread contamination. And it's you take a food that's growing in the field, it gets a lot of rain, they want to hurry up and harvest it. They then they process it, and it sits in a silo for a little while. Mold only takes 24 to 48 hours to grow if the conditions are right. So you end up with, mold growth very, very quickly. Either that or they spray it. So now you have contamination from the chemicals and potentially from the mold itself. And then they process it, and then they put it on a shipping container. And they send it across the ocean without any climate control for 30 days. And then it goes to another factory where it gets processed and put into bread or crackers or oatmeal or whatever it is. And then we wonder why we've got moldy food. It's just it's too long of a supply chain, and there's too much motivation to hurry up and get things to the destination. And there's opacity. And this is the big thing, is that there's nobody looking. And there's no way to know. But I will tell you, here's how you know. If it's a refined carbohydrate, it's high risk. If it's conventional meats and dairy, it's high risk. If it's imported grains, nuts, seeds, spices, coffee, tea, right? High risk. Now, tea, less so. Green leaves don't really get moldy very quickly. Green tea is actually safer. But when you start getting into anything that's wet processed, like coffee, very high risk. And so essentially the mold-free diet is, contrary to a lot of people say, no mushrooms. This is not true. Mushrooms are very good for you, actually. The mold-free diet is no sugar, no grains, no conventional meats and dairy, no berries that are older than 10 days, right? And you want to have your spices, believe it or not, hopefully if you can, mostly domestic. Of course, you can't do that with certain spices that are only grown overseas. But it's basically a strict ketogenic diet with pastured meats and dairy.
I know, but maybe you want to explain how does it go through the meat? Because the animal is eating the moldy stuff, and then that is in the animal now.
That's right.
And then when we eat that animal,
it's just like mercury with fish, right? So we're at the top of the food chain, and so mercury rises up, right? It starts with the sardines, and it goes to the medium-sized fish, and then ultimately to the top predators. And so, sharks tend to be high in mercury, and tuna tends to be high in mercury, and the same kind of thing happens with us. And mercury is not dissimilar. It's lipophilic. In other words, it likes to bind to fats, and it gets stuck in our fat cells, in our brain in most cases. With mycotoxins, it's the same kind of thing. So mycotoxins are lipophilic. They lodge in our fat cells. They also are hydrophobic, which means that it doesn't attach to water, which means that you don't excrete it, you don't pee it out. So lipophilic gets stuck in you, and then you can't excrete it easily. So it's a kind of a double whammy. And mycotoxins are also very heat resistant, so you can't even cook them out. So it's best to avoid the exposure in the first place. Now, when it comes to the animals being fed them, they're being fed grains that are non-human grade. What is it that makes grains not human grade? It's a good question. So first of all, they're probably not presentable. B, they probably are not stored in a way that is congruent with human food storage standards, right? And so what happens? They get moldy. Not every farm animal is being fed moldy grains, but a lot of them are. It's a very common problem. And so the animal is fed the moldy grains. It ends up in their fat cells. Of course, it's, fat. What's dairy, right? Dairy is glandular excretions loaded with fat. And so dairy is a very common source of what they call carryover effect, which is when animals eat one thing and then the animal that eats it gets that toxin. And so dairy is a major issue when it comes to mycotoxins, but also the fat that's in the meat will also carry the mycotoxins. So it's very important that you eat, grass-fed, pastured meats that are closer to nature, because guess what? Mold doesn't grow on grass, right? But it does grow on corn. If you're eating beef or drinking milk or any dairy product that is from an animal that was fed corn, you're getting not only the mycotoxins, but now glyphosate is so prevalent that you're also probably getting a nice dose of glyphosate too. So there's a lot of reasons why a no sugar, no grains, grass-fed pasture diet is critical in our modern era.
I know that you're also concerned about that VOC, but what's this acronym stands for, VOC?
Volatile organic compound. Volatile means that it will evaporate into the air at room temperature. So it's liquid at lower temperature, and then it evaporates at higher temperature. So a very common VOC that most of us love is alcohol. And other ones include the active ingredient in bleach, which is sodium hypochlorite. But we build our buildings out of mold food, and then we paint them with chemicals, petrochemicals that off gas, and they release VOCs into the building. So other common VOCs that people might be familiar with are formaldehyde, which is a group 1 carcinogen, but it's in our insulation, in our walls, the pink and yellow stuff. Also benzene, it comes from gasoline. These are compounds that molds also produce, but they're also very abundant in our chemical world. When it comes down to getting better from mold-related illness, it's about air, food, and attitude. Air is mold and VOCs. Now, mold also produces VOCs, but the VOCs can be independent of the mold. So it's mold and VOCs. So a low chemical environment and a clean, dry environment. That's air. Food is, like I said before, you want to avoid the imported stuff. You want to avoid sugar, grains, and conventional meats and dairy at a minimum. And then when it comes to attitude, we can talk about that too, which is really fascinating. And it's kind of, it rhymes. So it's hard not to say it in the same breath. But it's also an extremely important part of people getting better.
But Jason, about that VOC thing, I'm really curious about one thing, because, while you're very focused to mold and mycotoxins, I heard you in many conversations that you made that you're very concerned about these new smell, new car, new carpet, new paint. What is the correlation with the mold?
First of all, these are carcinogenic chemicals. So just on their face, not good, right? So when I smell a new house or a new car, so many people have this very positive association. You've arrived, right? It's just such a good feeling, and everyone loves that smell. When I smell that, I smell cancer, I smell autoimmune disease, I smell fatigue, I smell cognitive impairment. And then also what I see when I see that is I see people that will ultimately develop sensitivities to potentially mold and other chemicals.
Okay, I understand.
You breathe 13 to 15 times a minute. Just put this in perspective, okay? 13 to 15 times a minute over the course of 24 hours is 20,000 times a day. 20,000 times a day. So you have to think about every breath you take as a dose of whatever you're breathing, whatever's in the air. So it better be really good, right? It better be very healthy. It better be pristine. Otherwise, you're taking 20,000 doses of something that's potentially toxic or at least irritating. And so it's very important to recognize that that's the volume. And by the way, it's not just 20,000 breaths. It's 2,000 gallons. I don't know what it is in liters, but 2,000 gallons, which is enough to fill a swimming pool. That's how much you breathe every day. And if you weigh the air that you breathe, that same amount, it's 30 pounds of air. It's well more than you eat or drink, more than the food you eat and the water you drink combined. So air is your single largest environmental exposure. And so when it's loaded with chemicals, it can lead to all sorts of inflammatory, carcinogenic conditions, you name it, can trigger sensitivities to the mold. And then the opposite is also true, where a big mold exposure, which produces the microbial VOCs, the microbial volatile organic compounds, can actually trigger chemical sensitivities. So it works both ways.
Okay, then let's end this podcast with the attitude, because we have to give people the good positive vibe. And what should be the attitude about this whole, all these things that I'm listening, oh my God, I said I shouldn't eat this, that I shouldn't eat that. Thank God that I started eating mostly keto diet or protein-oriented diet. But, what should be the attitude? Because these seems scary.
Well, I think the first thing to recognize is that there's a big difference between being fearful and being discerning. Traffic lights, intersections, when you're driving towards an intersection, these are dangerous places, right? I mean, you're driving up there, people die in car accidents every day at intersections. This is a very, very scary thing, driving up to an intersection. If you don't pay attention to the signals and act accordingly, very dangerous. But you don't drive up to an intersection gripping the wheel with, white knuckles and sweating and freaking out because of the threat that is present in front of you, right? Instead, you're discerning. You apply the brake at the right time. You put on your turn signal. You stop at the red light. You go on the green light. What I encourage people to do is think about this the same way. Don't be fearful, because fear triggers a lot of the problems. The trigeminal nerve I spoke about before, the study on this is fascinating. So they found that anxiety makes the trigeminal nerve more sensitive, but the trigeminal irritation creates anxiety, and you end up with this loop. So getting to a place where you accept that mold is a normal part of our world. It's okay to have mold in our world. In fact, you can't avoid it. But what you can do is you can be discerning, and you can just be very vigilant about preventing it and then reacting quickly when it occurs. So that means you have to respond within 24 to 48 hours of a leak, stop the leak, dry it out. If you do that, that's discerning. That's applying the brake driving up to the intersection, right? You don't ignore that car that's in front of you. You don't drive right through them. Right. And so you want to make sure that you respond appropriately to your environment. And so accepting mold as a normal part of an environment is the first step. And also recognizing that you're never going to avoid it. This is mold. Being afraid of mold is like being afraid of gravity or sunlight. It's a fact of nature. It really is that fundamental. And so that's the first step, is sort of like acceptance and recognizing that we need mold. In fact, I would even argue that the mold is benevolent in many ways. I mean, it makes the delicious cheeses, and we need it for antibiotics. And, there's so many uses for mold, biofuels, so many amazing uses for mold. And we get mad about it because it makes us sick. And that's because we build buildings to support its growth, and then we ignore the things that we need to pay attention to prevent it from growing in our home. So that's the first part, okay, is basically accepting the fact that mold is an important part of our world. The next part is how you deal with the anxiety and all of the things that come from mold exposure. And anxiety, like I said, emotional dysregulation is a very, very common, it's a primary symptom, actually, of mold exposure. And for years, I have been hearing stories about people that have gone through something called neural retraining. Limbic system retraining. And so there was a woman named Annie Hopper. There is a woman named Annie Hopper who has a company called Dynamic Neural Retraining System, DNRS. And she was really the first person to pioneer all of this. And so you go through a series of exercises, kind of like allergy shots for the nervous system. You give these small exposures to the perceived threat. And it's very similar to the way they treat PTSD. Right, get exposed to the thing that makes you fearful in small amounts, and then back away from it, and then realize that you're okay. And you do this with perceived environmental threats. And by the way, you're also taking full responsibility for your condition. So this is a very important part of this, is that there's no victimhood in this whole thing, right? There's a personal ownership that's very important. But this process of small exposures to the perceived threat eventually creates a space that allows for the body to respond instead of to react. And so you end up basically creating discernment instead of this visceral fear. And so since Annie Hopper's work with DNRS, a number of other providers have emerged. There's a company called Reorigin. There's the Gupta method, which is often very well regarded. And most recently, the one that I really like the most is Primal Trust, which is the work of Dr. Kathleen King. And she's embedded a few other practices, including somatic work and essentially teaching your nervous system to calm down so that you're more prepared for these very natural environmental exposures. It tends to work really well with people that have Lyme disease because, again, Lyme and mold are on the same inflammatory pathway, and they tend to create a lot of anxiety and a lot of emotional dysregulation and a lot of social isolation too, which is very troubling. And so this idea that what's going on in the mind and what's going on in terms of an inflammatory response are very closely connected. So people who go through this Primal Trust program tend to have less inflammation when they're exposed to the same thing. So it's not just this sort of Newtonian thing where, you get exposed to this thing and it causes the inflammation and that's it. There's this mysterious part about how our mind actually has a say in whether you actually do get inflamed. And so the work that they're doing with this neural retraining is showing that we have a lot more control over this than we think we do. And I will also leave you with this idea. We don't have very much control in our world, if we're honest. Everything that's going on around us is pretty much happening, and we're a passenger here. And that's a very disempowering reality for most people. When it comes to the indoor air, we have a disproportionate potential for control if we choose to accept it. This is a place where we can control so many things, right? You can get really good air purifiers. You can ventilate the building. You can act quickly and responsibly when there's a moisture problem. You can choose not to bring chemicals into your home, whether they be the paints on the walls, the personal care products, or the cleaning products. You can choose to not bring in these things. And you can create a healing sanctuary in your home. And for me, that gives me peace of mind because I know I can go home to my home, no matter what hotel I slept in last night that smelled like chemicals or mold or whatever. And I know my home is a safe place. And that's empowering to me. But the thing is that most people don't know what to do. And that's why these podcasts are so important, is right. I want to give people the tools so that they can start making better decisions. But then the other piece that's really empowering is that food is also something that you have control over. What you put in your mouth is up to you. And so all the things we talked about are not these looming threats that you can't do anything about. On the contrary, all of them are actionable and they're within your purview. So I encourage people to, if you see something, smell something, or feel something, do something. And don't be fearful. Just choose wisely.
Thank you so much, Jason. You sounded like, in the New York trains, subways, there's this, if you see something, say something. I know that you're from New York. Thank you so much. This was very informing for me and everyone who's going to listen to us. And because we're going to translate it into Turkish, it's going to even make more sense, obviously, to people. Thank you for your time. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Ezra. It was a pleasure.